Namaste and welcome to another edition of the Bharat Varta Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us. I have the usual gang here, Ashish Chandorkar and Srivatsa Subana here to discuss the news and events from the week that was. Hey Ashish, hey Vatsa, how are you
Hi,
guys
Gary.
doing?
Hey, Kari.
So a lot happened last week and I'd love to discuss more with you guys. So maybe before that, as usual, let's begin with the episode that we put out last week. So relatively quiet week in terms of podcasts from Bharat Varta, right? But this I thought was a super comprehensive analysis of Tamil Nadu. Really, I mean, I thought people live a simple life, but there are so many underlying machinations at play, right? And Prasanna was able to thread everything wonderfully well in this 1 hour plus podcast we did on Tamil Nadu politics. What did you think, Ashish?
Oh, it was a brilliant podcast. Prasanna had so much detail about regional variations, castes, issues from the past election, leaders, pluses and minuses. I mean, their personalities, uh, personal dynamics between individuals who are involved in the elections, the role of Congress and BJP, which is kind of funny in the context of Tamil Nadu because neither of the national parties has got great leverage in the state. So I think it was a very comprehensive discussion, and in fact, I got a sense that Prasanna could have spoken for another hour actually if the recording kind of persisted because he had so much to kind of share, and he also had details sometimes at a seat level, vote shares, and all of that. So pretty fascinating, and I think I'll also encourage the viewers to listen to his forecast, which he has asked us not to troll him with if he gets it wrong. But towards the end, he actually made a forecast. Also, generally speaking, our Bharat Vata record on the election forecast has been quite good, right from the US election, then Bihar. I mean, we've done three in this season. We've done Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Bengal. So let's see how it fits in this election cycle.
Yeah. No, totally agree with you. I think it could have gone on for another hour. Literally every answer was a rabbit hole of rabbit holes. So yeah, we should probably do a follow-up sometime post that. So last week we launched premium subscriptions on our YouTube channel. Do check out Bharat Varta on YouTube. There are two options for you to engage with us, Plus and Prime. These give you a host of privileges ranging from social media badges and shout outs to exclusive footage that we're producing with subject matter experts on finance, history, and so on. So a lot of cool stuff available for grabs. And do check it out. It's only been about 7 days. We really haven't pushed it, but very encouraging signs. We're seeing plenty of people sign up. Do join our community. The first event that we're going to talk about is that a huge container ship blocked the Suez Canal last week. The 400-meter ship is blocking transit in both directions, holding back global trade through one of the most heavily trafficked waterways. The ship was stuck diagonally on Tuesday due to high winds and a dust storm. The rescue may take weeks to be successful, according to the Suez Canal Authority. A total of 206 large container ships have backed up at either end of the canal. According to some estimates, this blockage is causing $400 million of damage every hour. Wow. What's up? Pretty remarkable. What do you see as an impact, stemming from this?
Yeah, I think to start off, whoever thought that with 2020 all our troubles ended, clearly didn't know what was in store for us in 2021. So this is a pretty big event. So when it comes to international trade, Suez Canal is almost like an artery, much like the Panama Canal. It is a very strategic waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. So basically, earlier ships had to go around South Africa from Asia if they had to go to Europe. Uh, the Suez Canal has brought this distance down by more than 8,000 kilometers, right? And about, just to give some numbers, about 12% of world trade passes through the Suez Canal. 18,000 ships pass through the canal every year. So that's almost 50 ships a day. The total value, as you mentioned, is $9.6 billion of goods flow through the Suez Canal every day. Uh, I mean, all astounding numbers, right? And carrying around 1.2 billion tons of cargo. So that's the amount of trade flow that is blocked right now. The ship itself is, as you mentioned, about 400 meters long. So that's the length of about four football fields. And it's 60 meters wide. Well, the canal is around 900 feet wide, at that point where it's stuck. Uh, so, pretty much nothing else can move while this ship is stuck there. Uh, there are about 13 million barrels of oil that are stuck in the Suez Canal. I mean, I can go on and on. The numbers are pretty astounding in terms of, what's at stake here. So obviously, the entire shipping industry has suffered a lot because of COVID. First, containers were stuck. There was a lack of availability of containers. In general, supply chain routes were hit, and they're just, starting to recover, and they've been hit by this. And when you're talking of goods moving from Asia to Europe, you can't move them through road or rail. There's literally no other way to move, such large amounts of goods except through ship, right? But some of the ships have actually turned around and started to go around South Africa. So that's going to add about 12 days, to their journey, more fuel costs, and so on. So I think if it's resolved quickly, like within a few days or a week, I don't think there is much of an impact. Yes, there is, lots of ships waiting to get past the Suez Canal. But I think if it's resolved quickly, things will kind of get back on track within a few weeks. So there won't be much of an impact. But considering, the size of the ship itself and the fact that a ship of this size has never been kind of brought back, into the sea in a floating condition, or into the canal in a floating condition. This is like a whole new problem, even for companies that specialize in this, right? So it's a, I mean, in terms of the short term impact, it's big. It's going to delay a lot of trade. But if it gets resolved quickly, I think things will come back to normal pretty soon. If not, ships will have to start taking the longer route, which will add to cost, which will, hit the supply chains, cause delays, and so on. Right. So we just have to wait and see. I'm hopeful that things will kind of move quickly and we see the ship kind of back floating soon. If not, yeah, be ready for, bump in oil prices. I think across the world, you will see some, increases in costs of goods and so on.
It actually hits India quite badly, because while 10% of the global trade passes through the canal, for India, that number is close to 20-30%, depending on what estimate you look at. So much bigger issue for India in the coming months.
Interesting start to the year, no doubt. H&M and Nike are facing a backlash from Chinese state media and e-commerce platforms. They recently made statements of concern about forced labor in Xinjiang. Searches for clothing from H&M turned up no results on Alibaba's Tmall and JD.com. Searches for H&M's physical shops also turned up no results. The share price of H&M was down 3% on Thursday. Nike is also facing backlash after a months-old statement has begun circulating on Chinese social media. This backlash coincides with the diplomatic row between Beijing and Western countries anyway. The EU, US, UK, and Canada have imposed sanctions on China last week over the Xinjiang issue. Ashish, are we seeing the beginning of the end? Will the global supply chain be reconfigured after this? We've spoken plenty about this earlier, right? Is this one more adding to that?
Yeah, it kind of adds to the political uncertainty, right? And I think that's been the key theme why a lot of companies want to now diversify their production locations and so on. H&M is the second largest seller of clothes in the world. And what happened was some associations or some organizations linked to the Communist Party of China put a statement made by H&M and Nike on the Weibo platform, which is like the social media platform of China. And that caused a lot of backlash against the brands. the users started to give calls for boycotting these brands, saying that they were spreading incorrect propaganda with regards to the Xinjiang indentured labor and so on, right? And these companies were, in fact, there are some other companies also involved, like Adidas, for example. So the backlash happened against all the brands. H&M got hit worse because it was their statement which was pasted in full on the social media, and they got the worst of the backlash from the users. And there were videos floating around how their logos were taken off from the malls, and as you rightly said, the e-commerce platforms kind of delisted them or all their inventory basically. So I mean, a lot of other things also happened actually. So apart from the social boycott, like even the official media, for example, the People's Daily, which is like as close to the Communist Party as possible in China. So they also named these two firms along with Burberry, New Balance, which is a shoe seller, and also Adidas, plus Puma, Converse, Tommy Hilfiger, Uniqlo. A lot of these brands got named by People's Daily and in other social media posts, and all of them are getting boycotted. In fact, it has gone to extend that one of the big games which Tencent hosts, which is the Honor of Kings. They had a partnership with Burberry, and they have ended the partnership already, saying that they wouldn't work with the brands which are working against Chinese interests. So overall, I would say that the whole issue of let's face it. I mean, the issue of the Uyghur Muslim treatment of China has really not been taken up by the West in the manner that it should have been taken up, right? The way China has gone about the ethnic cleansing and the way they have treated their population. There's no parallel apart from the Nazi Holocaust, about in the last century, but they really haven't faced any backlash for it. So now this has become quite serious, and the challenge is that because the brands in general globally have become much more sensitive about quote unquote the perception of how they are seen and the fact that they want to intrude in the social issues, they also will find it difficult to take a step back here. So it sounds like a difficult time for, I don't know how it will get resolved basically. I mean, it sounds like quite difficult because there's a lot of people anger. And this is nothing unlike the boycotts which we see on Indian social media, right? Because in this case, the complete inventory has been destocked from online portals and so on. So a difficult time for the brands, and also because now they want to start manufacturing. They have to, if they really stick true to their words about the indentured labor in Xinjiang, then they'll have to start finding a location to manufacture. And then, of course, countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka should gain from that.
Right. Moving on. The US Defense Secretary, General Lloyd Austin, visited India to strengthen Indo-US ties. The officer conducted a 3-day visit to India. This was the first outreach since President Biden assumed office. He started off his visit by meeting Prime Minister Narendra Modi. General Austin also met Defense Minister Shri Rajnath Singh to discuss Indo-US strategic cooperation, defense sales, technology transfer, as well as an Indo-Pacific strategy. The evolving situation in the Indo-Pacific region in the wake of China's increasing military muscle flexing has become a major talking point among leading global powers. Vatsa, what do you make of this diplomatic visit? Also, he has quite an imposing presence, right?
Yeah, he's a 4-star general, and yeah, so it comes at a very interesting time, right? I mean, just I think last week or the week before was when US and China had a very public kind of spat where China basically I think started flexing their muscles, and it was something that was completely out of protocol, where they had a very public spat where they said that we are also a very strong country and so on. And this comes immediately after a virtual Quad meeting, right? So the Quad was something that President Trump had a lot of interest in, but it's taken up by the Biden administration as well. And India, the US, Japan, and Australia, they've actually decided to kind of expand their cooperation in this Indo-Pacific region. And China looks at the Quad, very suspiciously. So this visit also comes in the backdrop of that. And I think this is the first time that a Secretary of Defense, his debut kind of visit outside the US, has included India. So it's definitely a step forward. So what we have seen is that during the Trump administration, the Indo-US defense ties have definitely been on an upswing. In 2016, that was the last year of President Obama's administration, US had designated India as a major defense partner, and there was an agreement that allowed the militaries to use each other's bases for repairs and replenishment and so on. Again, there was another agreement in 2018 that provided for interoperability between the two militaries, and more sales of high tech kind of weapons from the US to India. And Secretary Austin himself came and said that his goal is to elevate the US India defense partnership. So definitely, as you mentioned, there is a lot of muscle flexing that is done by China on the South China Sea, and the US is kind of looking at some sort of counterbalance to that. And the Quad, which is essentially a kind of agglomeration of countries who are democratic and believe in a liberal democracies. Uh, so I think the belief in the US is that these kind of countries have to come together if we have to uh, counter a state like China. And I think Ashish also mentioned some of the ways in which China kind of runs pretty much an iron fist when it comes to dealing with its own citizens as well. Uh, so I think while the defense kind of agreements have taken place, and we are buying a bunch of drones from the US. We are also looking at buying aircraft from the US, $18 billion worth of aircraft, something companies like Boeing are interested in. Uh, so the defense partnership is going to become stronger over time. Though there is this thing where they want some senators and congressmen want to impose sanctions on India because we purchased the S-400 weapons from Russia. So it's, I think, a delicate kind of thing for India to balance the long-standing relationship with Russia and at the same time build relations with like-minded democracies. So we have to see how this goes forward, but the indication from the US is very clear that they are looking at us as a partner and they want to strengthen the relationship.
All right.
Also,
moving to
our episode 91 covered how we should deal with the Biden administration. So I think some of the prognosis made in that episode is coming wrong, which is probably good, at least, but still early days.
So I think we did mention, I think it was Abhishek who mentioned about the S-400.
Correct.
So that thing is definitely coming true.
Yeah, definitely do check out that episode. That was pretty interesting with Abhishek, Sunanda, and Ashish. All right. In news closer home, the Government of National Capital Territory of Delhi bill, wow, that's quite a mouthful, was passed amidst uproar from the opposition. During the Rajya Sabha discussion, the Congress, YSRCP, BJD, SP leaders, among others, staged a walkout from the upper house. It was passed by the lower house on 22nd March. The bill will enhance the power of the Delhi Lieutenant Governor by declaring him as the quote-unquote government of Delhi. This effectively puts the government of Delhi under the power of the center, bypassing the elected government of Delhi. So opposers of the bill have termed it unconstitutional. Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal termed it, again within quotes, a sad day for democracy. Ashish, your thoughts?
I think good choice of picture there. This is like the famous Dosti Bani Rahe meme, which is quite popular on Twitter, right? And I think that it's probably at a point where the Dosti has not been kept alive by the two parties. I think see, the state of Delhi is governed in a very curious way. And again, I'll say that we were probably, we were a pioneer in this discussion, because episode 2 of Bharat Varta, which was like long ago, I think Feb of 2020, we had talked about how unique was Delhi's management vis-a-vis other global capitals, right? And we had discussed how BJP was the one who insisted giving full statehood to Delhi, which was actually quite an illogical idea in 1990s. I mean, BJP had political reasons because they won the elections, the first elections, and they formed the first government in 93 and so on. And then because veteran leader Mr. Advani was used to contest from New Delhi. So they had their own reasons to give the Delhi full statehood, but it was quite a illogical thing to do then. And this bill kind of undoes some of that discussion or some of those ideas from that time. What the bill says is that wherever any act of which emanates in Delhi, which says government will be interpreted to say LG or the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, right? So that practically means that almost for everything that the elected government does, the LG will have to ratify, or LG will be seen as the person who's kind of who needs to agree to before those bills are passed. So that is the one major change. It also means that apart from the laws passed by the assembly being ratified by LG explicitly, there's also how the rules of the procedures of the assembly are run. So while the assembly can make its own rules, but these rules should be consistent with the procedures, etc., which are defined in central laws. So basically, what it will mean is that in the event of any concurrent list topic coming up, the powers of the Delhi Assembly to do something in the state of its own will be restricted or lesser compared to other states. Also, any administrative decisions which the assembly wants to undertake or any ministers want to undertake in Delhi, those will not be allowed. And any such rules which have been framed where the Delhi government has got, let's say, a say in the process, in the way the Delhi administration runs, even retrospectively, those laws will be held void. So stuff like the Delhi police needing specific permission or approval of the lawyers appointed by Delhi government for specific types of offenses and registering criminal cases, all of that will go away. Also, there are some areas where the LG is allowed to use or reserve some of the bills for presidential assent. So the LG may actually contact the president for approvals of specific bills, and all of this means that the powers of the elected government of Delhi will be severely curtailed. Now, the funny part is, you mentioned about the walkout. The funny part is the 3 of those 4 parties you named, YSRCP, BJD, and SP, said on the floor of Rajya Sabha that they were against the bill, but they did not vote against the bill. They essentially walked out, which essentially helped the BJP pass the bill. So good floor management by the government, but also it probably shows that how regional parties are wary of AAP's potentially rise, and once their clout in Delhi goes down, their ability to expand across the country also goes down because of the resources being limited and so on, right? So it might also be a case of jealousy, with respect to AAP. Of course, while AAP will have its own grievance and they may potentially even go to Supreme Court. I actually saw on Twitter that Mr. Kejriwal has changed his bio. I'm not quite sure if maybe I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or something which people missed earlier, but the bio no longer says anything to do with Delhi. It appears that he might be headed to Punjab for the elections. That's what the theories were, but I'm not quite sure about this one. But nonetheless, what's going to happen is that AAP will certainly not take this lying down. They'll go to the Supreme Court and challenge the act most definitely. But I think overall, it is a step in the right direction in the sense that how Delhi is governed, it should not be left to the. They shouldn't potentially even be an elected government. We can argue, and I'll probably urge people to listen to episode 2, which covers all of this in significant details.
Does that also mean that we'll not see full page ads in Hindi in South India from
unless LG allows it, but highly unlikely that the LG will. Also, who's going to be LG is also a theory, right? So there was some conspiracies around. Will Kiran Bedi come back and become the LG of Delhi? So we don't know that.
Interesting. It's also interesting how many of these news items that we're discussing have a link into one of the episodes, right, that we
Yeah.
produced before. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. Moving on, Prime Minister Modi is visiting Bangladesh. This is the first visit after the COVID-19 lockdown last year. He visited the country on occasion of Bangladesh's 50th year of liberation from Pakistan. Incidentally, we did an episode on that as well. And 50 years of diplomatic ties. He met with Bangladesh Prime Minister Hasina and liberation fighters known as Mukti Jodhas. He also tweeted before the trip that Bangladesh is an important pillar of India's neighborhood first policy. The Prime Minister inaugurates a wide range of programs aimed at furthering cooperation between the two countries. The tour took place amid the run up to the West Bengal and Assam assembly polls. Both are kind of hot states for the BJP. What do you see as an impact coming out of this visit?
So I think to start off, the trip, as you mentioned, it's to commemorate 50 years of Bangladesh's war of liberation and the birth centenary of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. We'd actually done a very interesting episode on the Bangladesh Liberation War episode. So I actually urge people who are watching this to watch that episode as well, because it covers the war in a lot of detail, and it's a very, very interesting episode. Uh, and it's not just India, other nations, other SAARC nations, such as leaders from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Maldives, have also been invited to different parts of the celebration. Only one country has been left out, who I think anyone can guess, right? Uh, in addition, I think there are two significant aspects to his trip, right? I think one is he's visiting the Jeshwareshwari temple in Ishwaripur, which is a goddess Kali temple, and is one of the Shakti Peeths of Hinduism. And also another trip to a Thakurbari in Orakandi. I hope I got the pronunciation right. This is the birthplace of Harichand Thakur, who formed the Matua sect. Matuas migrated from Bangladesh to West Bengal and are seen as like a significant, can have a significant impact on the West Bengal elections. So there's some conspiracy theory around the timing, but unless the PM kind of planned the war 50 years ago and the Liberation Day 50 years ago, I don't think the timing of this trip was something that he could have controlled.
Right.
The thing with Bangladesh is that Bangladesh is locked within India's borders, right? And it's a very important kind of neighbor in the sense that our connectivity to northeast of India through land is severely restricted through what is known as the chicken snake. But there are parts of the northeast, such as Tripura, for instance, where through the waterways in Bangladesh, or from Assam to Chittagong, and then from there to Tripura, goods can be moved, and this can actually speed up the movement of goods and across the northeast. So from that standpoint, Bangladesh becomes a very significant neighbor for us. So it's very important for us to have strong relations with Bangladesh and be able to have free movement of legitimate business and people and goods, right? The legal variety. So from that standpoint, any trip to Bangladesh, which focuses on improving the economic ties and also build some of this infrastructure which can be used by India for its own benefit, is something that is very important. We've come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years. We've resolved the land border dispute. We've resolved some of the issues related to using of waterways. There is now a Maitri Setu which connects Tripura to one of the ports in Bangladesh, so goods can move easily. So there has been progress made on multiple fronts, and it's important for development of Northeast, for these things to keep moving. And I think the Prime Minister realizes that. he's always focused on the Northeast from the time he became Prime Minister. And he understands that for India to see development in Northeast, this part of building infrastructure is very important. So I think that, and there are some other issues like sharing of Teesta River waters, uh, some sort of trade agreement. All of these are in the pipeline, and I think these will get resolved in the coming year.
Fantastic. All right, moving on. The last piece of news for the week. The Parliament cleared the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Amendment Bill. This bill aims to increase the contribution of mining to India's GDP, as well as decrease reliance on imports for staples such as coal. The country also has 22,000 million tons of iron ore reserve. Wow, that's a big number. And 500 million tons of gold ore. Restrictions on the end use of minerals by captive plants have been relaxed. This will also prevent hoarding of mines, a problem that has been plaguing the industry for decades. The new law mandates that whoever takes a mining lease has to start producing within 3 years of the mine being re-auctioned. Ashish, what is the big picture here?
So there are two big points here. One is that the central government assumes much more control over how mines are auctioned, and they can initiate auctions if the state governments are delaying processes. So that is one important change here. The center will have much greater say in the auction process itself. That is one. The second part is, which you kind of alluded to, is that the captive mines can now be used to sell minerals in the open market. So up to 50% of what a captive mine produces. Captive mine means that the mineral is being used for a specific end use. So that end use restriction has been made easy. So that relaxation means that some minerals can go to the market, which means the availability increases, which means the incentive to mine also increases for the bidders. So the issue around hoarding will reduce, and the market will open up in terms of the accessibility to the minerals. This excludes 3 minerals, which is coal, lignite, and anything to do with nuclear power. But for everything else, these laws will be applicable. This should really get new investments in the mining industry, and specifically in the states which are aligned with the central view, like states like Jharkhand or Odisha, most of the times Odisha, MP, Karnataka, where there are mines and then there is a potential. I think these states can benefit. This will also probably persuade states like Chhattisgarh, Goa, where there have been issues in terms of managing mines in the past, to change their view and allow for much more commercial operations and investments. The act also relaxes the procedures carry. So in terms of how the approvals are taken, how the approvals are renewed, a lot of those processes also get simplified. So overall, a great announcement for the mining industry. Should help in more industrialization and more GDP growth.
Fantastic. All right. So that's a wrap from us. Thank you so much for all of the love and support. Please keep your comments and suggestions and anything else that you would like to share with us. Please keep them coming. Over the last week, we've received plenty of good comments, and it's really inspiring to see this. We'll put in a lot more effort to produce fantastic content for you. So that's a wrap from us. Thank you again for joining us. From Ashish, Vatsa, and myself, thank you. Take care, and hope to see you soon.